Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Marina Ichon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. Well, Tim, it's been an exciting and dramatic-filled 2 weeks after the election. We've been following all the nominees, and we are absolutely thrilled to hear that Chris Wright, who is a PRI board member, will be the Trump nominee for the Department of Energy. So that's exciting. He was a founder of Liberty Resources, an energy firm, and our audiences might remember that he was the person who created the "Thank You North Face" video when North Face refused the business of an energy company that wanted to put its logo on North Face jackets. North Face said no, and Chris pointed out that 90% of North Face's merchandise was actually due to the oil and gas industry. So the ad went viral, and it was really terrific. So Tim, what do you think of Chris's nomination?
Well, certainly unexpected, but I think it's a brilliant choice. You know, it's clear, as we saw in the first Trump administration, that creating energy in America, drill baby drill, fracking, having more abundant and affordable domestic sources of energy was and is going to be a big priority for President Trump. And I think nominating Chris Wright as Secretary of Energy, there couldn't be a better advocate for that, someone who A, has done it and understands how to do it, but B, to whether in Congress or in the media or as these proposals go forward, someone who can really educate the American people and push back on misinformation and the often charges you see on from the left about these energy policies. So I think for, having energy independence again, there's probably no one better to have on the team than Chris Wright.
And Tim, you were always a fan of Burgum, so you must be pleased about that.
Well, I think, and again, Burgum spent a lot of time in California. Remember, he spent a lot of time at Stanford and is a really smart innovator, entrepreneur. And so I think the two of them together basically they're going to have a new American Energy Council that the two of them are going to be the primary leaders of. So I think that's a great, 1-2 punch for promoting American energy production and American energy independence.
Yeah, and let's not forget Lee Zeldin at EPA. So that was a very good choice too.
Yeah, I mean, if you're interested in, kind of free market energy policies that lower costs and increase abundance, this is kind of the dream team for you. So A+ appointments, and we'll see who else joins the team to push this important American energy agenda. But great appointments so far in this area.
Well, and of course, Trump being Trump, there are also controversial appointments. So what do you make of those?
No one can bat 1,000, I suppose. It seems like there are just certain areas of the federal government that President Trump wants to just have someone in there to do battle with and go in there and fire everybody and yell and scream and take it in a radically different direction. Well, that doesn't, and the people that he's selected are basically in the kind of Department of Justice and defense areas. These are people that largely reflect his worldview and what he wants to do. The issue is, of course, that, some of them have issues with their character and past scandals, and others, there are real questions about, can that person actually run a federal agency of enormous size? They may share the values, but can they actually go in, run the department, and affect the change that both the secretary and the president wants to see? So I think you can expect big grillings in the Senate for these controversial nominees. Just takes 4 no votes from Republicans to stop anyone. But there's a lot of discussion about, especially for Matt Gaetz, who's very unpopular now, former member of Congress. He has, investigation into some sexual improprieties that may or may not be released. And, he was one of the Crazy Eight that took out Kevin McCarthy as Speaker. So there are real questions whether he can get the votes, but I think it remains to be seen. I think people should not be too quick to judge that some of these folks have no chance to be confirmed because we've seen stranger things in Washington.
Well, the senators are going to have to pick and choose their battles, and there are enough controversial appointments that they're going to have to be, well, I would say, prudent about who they're going to vote down, and it'll be into only McConnell probably has the freedom to vote down anybody he wants. But we'll see as the drama unfolds, right, Tim?
That's right. That's right. And I think that's the other thing, right? Is, usually one or two nominees either, withdraw because they don't have enough support or, there's a scandal, something comes to light, or, the Senate rejects them outright. But it's unrealistic to think that all of these more controversial nominees are going to be rejected. They're just not. And so how the ball bounces in these different hearings, if you have one or two really controversial folks that take a lot of the incoming fire, well, some of the others don't look as wild in comparison.
So let's shift the focus back to California. So Newsom had called a special session of the legislature to essentially fund the California Justice Department and other agencies to sue Trump, the Trump administration, for policies that they're not going to agree with. And of course, that would be climate change, and I assume there'll be other changes in migrant policies that's gonna counter California's very liberal positions on these. So what's happening there?
Well, the special session, which would start concurrently with the new legislature that's going to convene on December 2nd, and the whole purpose of it will be basically funding. I don't know how many bills there will be, but it basically will be giving Attorney General Rob Bonta additional tens of millions of dollars to file whatever lawsuits they want to file against Trump administration policies. And yes, as you suggested, it'll be all of these kind of social issues and the environment and such. And, that's basically what a lot of states, left-wing states, did in the first Trump administration, including California. Attorney generals kind of ran amok with filing lawsuits. So I think you could expect that any kind of controversial policy that the Trump administration rolls out, they're going to be sued. Now, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be successful in court, but it drags you down. And so, that's one part of the, quote, the Newsom fight to, kind of preserve the California way in court. They're also pursuing another fight where you saw the governor was in Washington, D.C. last week meeting with President Biden, and they're trying to get money out the door, regulatory approvals before January 20th, kind of lock in place approvals for some of these California way policies, especially in environmental areas. So, you're going to see that aggressive effort before the clock runs out on the Biden administration. But, I don't think it's a surprise that they're doing this, but I think it's, as I mentioned on our podcast about the election, the biggest winner and loser of the election was Gavin Newsom. He now is and he's seizing the mantle of the number one liberal resistor to Donald Trump. And this is one area where he can get a lot of public traction, even though it's Rob Bonta filing the cases, against the Trump administration over the next 4 years. Now, he's also the biggest loser because voters in the rest of the country basically rejected Newsom's California way. So as far as PR for Newsom and kind of what you would expect liberal states to do in response to the Trump administration, yeah, this is exactly what I would expect they would do.
Well, for my 2 cents, Tim, this is plainly a boondoggle for government lawyers and bureaucrats. So believe it or not, folks, your tax dollars are actually going to fund litigation to fight against lowering your gas and energy costs. So I think you're right, Tim. I guess he didn't get the memo. I guess Newsom didn't get the memo that Trump took more votes in California. I read the other day 4% more than he did in 2016. Clearly, the state wants relief from some of these progressive policies that have raised the cost of living, increased crime, and really has done nothing to reduce issues like homelessness. So if I were Newsom, I would take a page from Bill Clinton's book and lurch center, if not right, immediately. So clearly the American people have spoken. President Trump had a resounding victory, won all the swing states, and the House and Senate will have a majority of Republicans. And Californians and California businesses sent their message, have been sending their message for years, and are moving to other states in droves. So Americans and Californians are tired of progressive policies and politics. And really, I think if Newsom wanted to move more center, I think that would be the more prudent thing to do.
Well, the other thing too to keep an eye on is that, it's not just Department of Justice lawyers who are going to be spending this money. Look for Bonta to, as is a common practice when the Attorney General files suit, all the Department of Justice lawyers have expertise in a particular area. So look for them to contract out with big liberal lawyers to fight some of these cases on behalf of the state of California. So, it's another kind of full employment act and lifeline for, folks who might be losing their jobs and a lot of business in the coming weeks.
So, Timla, how about introducing our podcast guests?
Well, we have a terrific guest this week. I think for the Times, he's a perfect guest. So a longtime friend of mine. I actually went to high school with him, Dallas Lawrence, who's been a communicator at the top levels of government and the military and corporate America. And he has a terrific book out called Communicating Under Fire, The Mindset to Survive Any Crisis and Emerge Stronger. And he basically, as you'll hear in our discussion, he makes the case that all of us, wherever we're at in business or in life, we're going to face a kind of a communications crisis at some point or another in our lives or in our careers. And you got to be aware of it, and you got to kind of start to think about how do you prepare yourself for this inevitable communications crisis. And his book is a really user-friendly book that gives you a lot of advice and a lot of real-life examples, some of which are from Dallas's own career. But I think it's a really interesting read for the communications novice or the PR pro. And so we go through all of these issues. How do you deal with being a victim of cancel culture? What can you do to kind of move the needle back to get back on track, preserve your companies or restore your companies or your personal reputation? So it's a very interesting book, very interesting discussion. So I think you'll all enjoy it.
Yes, and I hope Dallas sells a lot of books in Washington, D.C., because everyone could certainly use his book. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and here's Dallas.
We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week.
Dallas, we're thrilled to have you on Next Round to talk about your new book, Communicating Under Fire. So for our listeners who may not be familiar with your work, share a little bit about your background and why you decided to write this book.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be with the both of you. I'm kind of a little bit of a unique character in the world of communications and public affairs, and that I have a dual citizenship. And by that, I mean, I'm old enough that I started my career in the age of traditional media, where the few select reporters could determine the news cycle, a few select media outlets really could shape a narrative. But then I also quickly transitioned and came up in the era of social and digital media. And so it kind of has given me a unique perspective to understand how both of these two sides of the ecosystem can really shape perceptions. My career spanned kind of two different tranches. The first half I spent in politics. I was honored to spend about 7 years working for President George W. Bush in a variety of roles. I was a White House spokesperson for the war in Iraq. I came back and later served Secretary Donald Rumsfeld as head of public liaison for the Pentagon. That's where I really began my transition into the social media side, where I helped build the Pentagon's first ever new media division. That's how old I am. We used to call it new media back then before we called it social media. And then I transitioned into the world of crisis when I left the Bush administration, joining a crisis PR agencies and really traveling the world, managing everything from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster for the US nuclear industry to the Boston terror bombing, product liability recalls, the collapse of Wall Street, the Boy Scouts, and on down the line have all given me kind of a front row seat to how you manage a reputation in today's media cycle.
So, Dallas, your book, of course, appealed to me as someone who's had to work in the wacky world of press and communications for many years. And what I think is great about it is it has so many great stories and so many great real life examples of people, many of whom, the readers would be familiar with, who have faced these communication crises, such as, what Netflix went through when they had the release of that Dave Chappelle special, or, Southwest Airlines dealing with the mass flight cancellations. And, I think many people may not realize is that all these companies, had very well thought out plans in place for how to respond to these crises. But yet, despite all of that, they still went through some public headaches. So break it down for the listener. Why is good planning alone not sufficient to avoid or steer you out of a communication crisis?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would tell you the central thesis of the book is that it's only a matter of when, not if your crisis moment happens. And all the crisis avoidance planning you can do is only going to build a false sense of security that somehow your number's not going to come up on the crisis wheel of destiny. And the reality is, it's only a matter of time. So let's take a look at the two examples you just mentioned, Southwest Airlines and Netflix. Southwest Airlines has tens of thousands of people in the air every day, hundreds of flights. They are going to have major delays, huge crises that are going to come their way. But they can't avoid their crisis. They have to have the intestinal fortitude in the planes to know how to navigate, have that muscle memory to navigate through it. If you're Netflix and you're spending $20 billion on content, you are going to anger some advocacy group at some point. It was a miracle it hadn't happened sooner. So you have to have that kind of wherewithal to know how to navigate through it. So the reality is, if you react when those moments happen, it's really how you react in those moments that determine how hot the crisis fire will burn. So, the central thesis whenever I do presentations and when I left government and kind of went into the corporate world, moved out to LA, I was brought in by USC's Annenberg School to create the Crisis Communications graduate course. And I remember my students would constantly ask this question: how do you avoid a crisis? How do you avoid a crisis? And we would hammer down and say, this is not about avoiding the crisis. It's going to happen. You can have all the best planning and the smart thinking. It's really about how you navigate through that moment when it comes and how you're prepared for it when it hits you.
So Dallas, in the foreword, you equate yourself to as a skilled communications pro, helping steer companies out of a crisis to that of a communications firefighter. Make the case that corporate leaders should be thinking in terms of the skills that a firefighter applies to putting out a major blaze as how one should be thinking about dealing with communications crisis. So explain your thinking here.
Yeah, it's really kind of came from my neighbor who was a firefighter, and he and I were sitting out talking one day, and I really began to hear from him this analogy that I thought spoke so clearly to crisis communications. And that analogy is that, every fire burns differently, but there's a science to how they burn. That's why, when you can tell what accelerated the fire or what ultimately extinguished it, they can trace it back and identify how it happened because there is a science they can follow back. So that really got me to thinking about the very similar truths that happen in crisis communications. There is a science. No two crises are the same, but actually there is kind of a guidebook that if you have embraced and understand, you kind of know what's going to come next. And you know that between the choices that you have to engage or not engage, or lawyer up or not lawyer up, you can kind of determine the outcomes that are going to come next. And it also speaks to the fact that I think, just because you have a crisis plan doesn't mean you know how to use it. So just because, my neighborhood was part of a terrible fire a couple of years back, just because I have a hose and a shovel does not mean I know how to put out a fire. I have not trained for it. I don't have the mindset of the firefighter. That's not what I do for a living. It's not what I'm prepared for. And that's a real key takeaway of this book, because if you look at companies today, roughly half, for example, don't have a crisis communications plan. But let's just take those half that do. Just having that plan does not mean that you're ready to deploy it. It doesn't mean that you have built the kind of the muscle memory and the reflexes to deploy in a crisis. And I'll give you one of my favorite examples of this. I was working for a large oil and gas company, and we were down in Brazil, and I went down there to do a live crisis drill. This was somewhat after the BP disaster off the Florida coast. So all the oil and gas companies were really thinking about how do they have a crisis plan ready. And I went in there with our team, probably 20 people from this large oil and gas company gathered around the table. And three things were takeaway memories for me that really speak to this moment of just because you have the tools does not mean you have the knowledge and how to use them. The first was they brought out this binder, and it was this beautiful binder, 3 rings, multicolored tabs. It had a tab for everything. I think it must have been 30 tabs, and they were very, very proud of this binder. And I asked the question, I said, okay, so what do you do when a crisis hits and it's happening in the digital and social ecosystem and you're being hit on all sides? How do you respond? And I kid you not, I wish I'd taken a photo of this. They had a tab for digital media, and they flipped open the book and it said engage digital media. That was their strategy. So it was a real kind of aha moment that just because you have the plan doesn't mean you're ready to engage on. The second takeaway just from that moment as I'm thinking back that I think is a really important one for all of us to understand is you have to know your crisis team. You have to have a good relationship with them, most especially, and it's a key tenet throughout my book, that there are 2 kind of co-equal players in the crisis scenario that can either be complementary or they can run into each other repeatedly, causing unnecessary angst. And that's your legal and your communications team. And one of the worst things you'll ever see, and I saw this when we were down there in Brazil, was I saw the general counsel hand his business card to the head of communications. It was the first time they had ever met. So again, another key lesson there is to make sure that your team knows each other well, that you have built the trust together in these crisis moments. So when they hit, the lawyer knows you're not going to bring in unnecessary risk, and the communication person knows that the lawyer has a job to do, and the two of them together then can work together to get a better outcome.
So as you noted in the book, perhaps the question you get asked the most is, well, how do you avoid a crisis? But as you write, it's really a bad starting point for thinking about how to deal with crisis communications, because it really, if you think about it, it's a matter of if not when you'll face one. So why, in your view, is just having this simple level of awareness one of the most important things you can do to address the inevitable crisis that any corporate leader is going to face someday?
Yeah, I think because it changes your posture. So if your posture is one of hoping to avoid a crisis and building a moat around your organization to avoid the crisis, you're not actually planning for how to respond to the crisis. You're doing everything you can to hope that the response never has to happen. You've not trained for it. You've not prepared for it. You don't have the tools to do it. You don't have the ability to listen, to understand what's happening in the social and digital ecosystem, because your whole ethos as an organization is we're never going to have a crisis, because we are so buttoned up and so well trained that it's not going to happen. And the fundamental reality is that's just not a realistic approach to have in today's business. So, I have a whole chapter or 2 on data breaches, for example. And I'll tell you, if you're just about any company, organization, nonprofit today, you are probably going to have an issue with data where you're going to have a data breach. You either might be the victim of an international spy ring from Russia or corporate-backed espionage from China, or you could just have an employee that accidentally, left the thumb drive with the entire company workforce social security numbers at a Starbucks. That actually happened for a large company. So these are things that no matter how much you plan for, people are human and it's going to happen. So that's why I say that when you shift the mindset to it's a matter of when, not if, all the things you do to prepare are very different. You're actually preparing to go into battle versus preparing that you're only going to stay in peacetime. And that's just a different mindset that I think is very important for anybody who has a reputation to defend, whether it's a personal one, an organizational one, a community one, a business one, to have kind of at the front of the top of their chain of thinking.
So most people's instincts when hit with a crisis is to fall silent, go inward, shut the door. But you offer an example in your book from the Boston Marathon shooter manhunt that shows the importance of not only controlling the message. How does this case show how we should begin to respond, but also how we should think about the instantaneous nature of media coverage these days?
Yeah, it's kind of hard. You have to go back in the time machine. I remember the time around the Boston terror bombing. It was the first terrorist attack that was really in what I call the 1440 news cycle. And that's the news cycle that I call that we live in today. So we really exited the quote 24/7 news cycle that we all kind of grew up with, which was the cable news cycle. And you'd have a couple cable shows and the nightly news. And in some cases, you had a morning paper and an evening paper. And we've entered what I call the 1440 news cycle. That's how many minutes are in a day. There's 1440 minutes in a day. And in today's news cycle, literally every single one of those is critical. And that's simply because the number of media outlets has exploded. So you think about, our traditional media outlets. Yes, we watch the cable news, but you have the whole slew of, bloggers and podcasters like yourself and others who have a huge reach that are constantly looking for information stories to feed the beast. So with that kind of background, you go back in time to the Boston terror bombing. And, for me, I had actually been in Boston about 2 weeks before the attack happened, giving a speech on crisis communication. And at the end of the speech, this enormous man, I'll never forget, his hands were the size, his one hand fit my entire arm. He was just this huge, bigger than life guy, shook my hand and handed me his business card and said, I think we could probably use your help. Law enforcement isn't really thinking about this. And this was the commissioner of the Boston Police Department. And I said, absolutely, I'd be delighted to help and, come out and do whatever I can help to help the Boston Police Department in the future. He said, okay, we'll talk in the future. Well, lo and behold, not long after that, the terror attack happened. And within literally minutes, it seems like at this point, received a call from his staff saying, this was playing out in a way they had never seen before. The terrorists were actually getting their news and information. They were seeing it online. They were seeing video of them. They were able to stay ahead of the manhunt. Misinformation was flowing everywhere. How do they get ahead of this? And so one of the things that we said is we recognize that the old playbook of, where the police department or any corporate leader would go out to the cameras and give their statement for the day and then go back into their war room and work for the next 3 hours is gone, because every minute of that day was being filled by content. And you had so much misinformation flowing in. You had misinformation reports that they were captured and when they weren't captured. So what we did with the Boston Police Department is we said, look, we are now establishing what we called Twitter back then, now X, as the real-time update vehicle for this news coverage. If you don't see it on Twitter, it's not real. And so we're not going to wait to go to our press conference if we have breaking news. We're going to break it on Twitter so you can get it in real time. And what you began to see instantly is every single reporter was then feverishly monitoring that news cycle, that news outlet, the Twitter news outlet, knowing that if it didn't come on that site, it wasn't true. And one of my favorite video clips that I show when I do this presentation live is there's a clip of Anderson Cooper. And Anderson Cooper standing on the street and he's live reporting and he literally stops mid-sentence and says, we've just received a tweet. Wait, he hadn't even heard it yet. It was being read into his ear live by his producer that he was then reading out live on live air. That's how the news cycle has changed. 10 years ago, they would have wanted to vet the source. They would have wanted to make sure that everything was buttoned up. Now they're pulling the stuff in real time. And it's important for all of us who have reputations we're defending to recognize that's the speed at which communications is happening and to make sure that we're on those platforms where the discussion's occurring.
We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know. Kind of following up on that, you make the case that when you're thinking about what prep work you can do as a company, that executives should really think in terms of, there's that old adage, right, of keep your friends close and keep your enemies closer. But really, you should keep the media closest. So what are a few tips you have for people trying to manage their professional and media relationships, good and bad, that can really lay the groundwork to minimize the fallout from that inevitable future crisis?
Well, Tim, that's why they have to buy the book. But no, like I'll give you a couple that I think are really most important. And feel free to cut me off if I'm going too long here, because I think these are three key ones that I think are important to think about. So we say, keep your friends close. And what I mean by that in a crisis is, whether you're a brand, a politician, elected, a celebrity, a local community organization, you have a built-in group of people who support you. They could be your employees. Literally, the gamut's pretty long. You know that you have this group of friends out there who have a vested interest in your mission continuing. You want to make sure that you have taken the time during your peacetime to be able to move those fans into apostles if and when a crisis happens. And what I mean by that is there's lots of people who will give you a thumbs up, but they're not going to jump into the crisis fires with you unless you have really brought them in and given them a reason to invest. So whether that's, I had a client back in the day, a large pharmaceutical company, and we were preparing to announce a pretty important recall of a product. And we knew that parents were going to be concerned and upset. So one of the things that we did is we reached out to a whole bunch of nurses and a whole bunch of mom influencers. And we said, we want to bring you into the fold. We want you to know in advance what's about to happen. So you have all the information and all the data. And then when the crisis happened, when it was announced, all of those voices jumped in and said, wait, no, we actually know the facts. We've had the briefing. We've talked to the nurses. We had hospitals that were tweeting out saying, no, what you're hearing is wrong. It's incorrect. The product is actually safe. It's just a packaging issue. So take the time to identify your built-in fan base, those who are going to intuitively want to support you, and bring them in before the fires are burning. Because it's a lot harder to bring them into the fold and get them to want to move from that fan to apostle phase where they're going to go out and support you if you haven't done it before. Secondly, enemies. Look, I think the other side of that coin is almost every organization, politician, whoever it might be, has a built-in group of people who are just opposed to them. One of my favorite stories is I had another large consumer products client back in the day, and every single year at the same exact week, they would get hit by an environmental group over the safety of sunscreen. It happened like the first week of summer. Every year it came out. So we knew it was going to come out. So we were monitoring their activities. We wanted to make sure we knew what was going to be said and we were prepared for it. But the reality is, when I say make sure you know who your enemies are, there's a second piece to that. And this is about using your peacetime and having the tools ready. Not every single person who's attacking you or who's screaming at you requires a response. And that is one of the biggest challenges in a crisis. So you're going to see, if you have your crisis moment, whether it's small, medium, large, you're going to have what feels like a tsunami of people commenting on you, whether that's on Reddit threads or on Twitter, saying that you're, evil. The challenge is you cannot play whack-a-mole with those 100, 500, 10,000, 500,000, 2 million posts that come out. You have to have the tools to immediately be able to recognize which voices have the ability to shape opinion and which don't. And there's a ton of free tools out there, also paid ones that you can use, that will help you understand the voices that are driving a social conversation, which ones have the most authority, and then you can engage and make sure you try to at least assuage or give some reason for those folks to have a reason to believe that you have a way out of this crisis. The last one I would say you mentioned is the media. Look, I've spent the last 25 years working with media. I love reporters. They do an amazing job. And I worked with reporters in the past, was mostly during really bad times where, if I had my will, they just wouldn't be covering us at all. But the reality is they have a job to do. And one of the things that you'll find about reporters is that they're human just like everybody else. And so, yes, they'll make mistakes. That's true. But when I say they're human, it means you're far more likely to have a better outcome with a reporter that you've already built a relationship with before your crisis moment than one who's calling you for the very first time, who's never done a story with you, who doesn't know they can trust your word, who you've not helped on other stories and built a well of goodwill with. So across those three, again, I have got chapters on all of these that give them much more depth, but knowing how to take your friends and fans and convert them to apostles before you need them is key. Knowing how to identify which attacking voices are the most relevant in times of a crisis is critical. Otherwise, you will literally have death by 1,000 cuts. And lastly, having built relationships with the media reporters, take them out to dinner, take them out for a glass of wine, have a cup of coffee, before that crisis moment comes, to build that relationship will pay huge dividends in the aftermath.
As you write about in the book, we live in an era not only of 24/7 and social media, but also shareholder activism. There are countless threats from within your organization, from someone engaging in bad actions that could cause reputational harm, whether intended or not. Everyone from whistleblowers and activist investors seeking policy policy changes for a political agenda. So in your view, how can companies prepare to mitigate these internal threats that could lead to embarrassing headlines and major stock sell-offs?
Yeah, I'm always reminded of a quote I heard while I was working at the Pentagon for the Secretary of Defense. And it was right after a very painful crisis moment where a video was uploaded by a soldier that had done something wrong in a foreign country we were deployed in. And the senior military officer I was sitting next to said, "I can guarantee you this. Somewhere, someone of the 2.5 million military men and women somewhere on this planet is doing something incredibly stupid. And that's been that way since time immemorial. The difference is now they're taping it on, they're videoing it, they're posting it, they're sharing it, and it's going viral." And that's the reality we all have to have. Humans are fallible. They make mistakes. And there are two kind of key takeaways I would tell anybody who has a workforce or those who are responsible for them that they have to really internalize in this day and age. The first is there is no personal social media. Anything your employees, your workforce, your volunteers on a campaign posts or say will be a direct reflection upon you as the organization. There is no forgiveness in today's society. So the battlefield is littered with mistakes of folks who did this, whether it's the lawyer from, I think it was CBS, who posted after the shootings in Vegas that, she was glad these folks, I'm sure they were all Republicans, and how do they feel now? And CBS was taken to task for it, saying, how can you have an employee working for you that does this? They ultimately fired her very quickly. And that was a lawyer. You would have thought she would have known better. So the reality is today is that you are responsible for every action and comment that your employees take on social and digital media. They are a reflection upon you. It may not be fair. That's just the reality. And when I say you're responsible, I don't mean you're legally responsible. I'm saying that's the social norm today. The norm of our society, we expect you to hold your workforce responsible if they say egregious things. So that leads to the second part of this. If you accept that awareness that, okay, I have a responsibility to make sure those who work for me, support for me, volunteer me, whatever you might be, understand how to use these tools today. That's number two. So something like the last survey I saw said 65 to 70% of companies don't have a social media use policy. And I'll tell you what, there are two types of social media policies you can develop. There's the kind that works and the kind that doesn't work. I'll start with the kind that doesn't work. The kind that doesn't work is the what not to do policy. And I've seen so many of these. It says, here's the 10 things you can't do. You can't post, you can't shoot videos, you can't do all these things. Those will never work. We are a social society. We post, we tweet, we TikTok, we YouTube. That's who we are. So by saying don't do it and then patting yourself on the back saying, okay, we're protected now, is just like saying we're going to have a crisis avoidance policy and just hope that we never have a crisis. So what you have to do is you have to develop a how-to policy where you train your employees and you help them understand the risks that they are opening themselves up to when they post, and the reality that nothing that they post is private. Nowhere. It's going to be a reflection upon them and ultimately their employer. And when you train that and instill that, you start to see kind of an aha awakening that happens amongst folks. You say, okay, I can't say things on social media that I wouldn't say to your face. It's not this black hole that I go into. It's actually another representative. It's just as equally representative as if I were to be posting it on our company website in many cases. So I think those are two kind of key things that I try to impart with folks, is just recognizing that, ultimately you as the organization will be responsible. And secondly, how do you train your workforce to navigate that?
Now, whether you're involved in running a business or not, I think one topic you cover in your book that will resonate certainly with the politically minded listeners, cancel culture. And, as you write, it's not only conservatives who are being victims of cancel culture, but it's a big issue in corporate America as well. So what, in your view, can people who are at risk of being canceled do to avoid being silenced and hopefully salvage some of their reputation so they can continue in the corporate world?
Yeah, those two C words are the most feared words, I think, in communication today. Cancel culture. People are terrified of it. And the reality is, look, they're sensational when you see it. That's why people are afraid of it. It's very unlikely you're going to face cancel culture. But the reality is, because of everyone has a bully pulpit now, they can launch from whether you're being attacked on the social media app next door by your neighbors for something, or you're on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, New York Times. So I do have a whole chapter I walk through this, because there is again, getting back to how we talked about at the beginning, there's a science to things. There is a science to how you can emerge through one of these moments. Unfortunately, it is a really tough path. And it runs counter to so many basic human instincts, which is why you see so many people make the problem worse while they're trying to make it better. So they're adding oxygen to a fire when the goal is to actually extinguish that fire. So I think a couple things. Natural human instinct when facing cancel culture is to immediately feel sorry for yourself. You're being attacked. You feel like the victim. No matter what you're being attacked for, whether it's a comment that you made that's been taken out of context, something you said 25 years ago, something that's entirely false, something you regret saying, your still initial gut reaction is to be angry and feel sorry for yourself. And far too many times, and I have a couple examples in the book, that's what guides the initial reaction. The initial reaction of one that says, how dare you? Or you try to explain. And one of the oldest, sayings in crisis communications is if you're explaining, you're probably losing. So the first step in cancel culture is one, to recognize you don't get to have a pity party. And that's step one. No one's going to feel sorry for you yet. You've not earned the right to be a victim yet in a cancel culture situation. Second, and this is kind of one of the hardest ones. You got to own it. If you fouled up, even if it was 25 years ago, own it. Americans, humans, we love contrition. We love someone who says, you know what? I was wrong back then. I've made a mistake and I've grown. It is one of the most natural. We just, the history books are full of it, of people who owned it and were allowed to come back and rise from the ashes like the phoenix. Who do we not like? People who don't believe they can own it and recognize they made a mistake. Now, you're lawyers, and if you're an organization or company are going to say, oh, we can't own it, we open ourselves to liability, you've got to find a path. If you have broken a societal norm, again, now we're not talking about if you've murdered somebody or if you've done something horribly illegal. This is the typical cancel culture. If you've broken a societal norm, but you're not facing federal prison for it, first step is to own it. The second step is to stop talking and listen. And what you'll find from listening is you'll start to find that not everyone who's throwing a grenade at you is actually part of the bandwagon of just the hate mob and who enjoy the drive-by shootings of the moment. There are actually some people who've been really hurt either by your comments or hurt by things similar to it, who are raising their voice to say, what you've done is hurtful because of X or Y. There is so much gold in listening for those commentary, because that's your pathway out. When you understand that there are actual folks who've been hurt legitimately by either your comments or things similar to it, and you take that moment to say, okay, how do I make some good out of this? How do I take this moment and say, I need to then take all the media attention that's on me and shine a light to recognize that there's good that can come from this moment by helping to address the harm that I either did intentionally or did a long time ago or have been accused of doing and still don't believe that I did. That's your moment. That's your moment to pivot. That can't come earlier. This is the challenge a lot of people have, is they want to try to pivot before they've owned it, before they've listened, before they've apologized. They can own it, listen, apologize, and then that moment comes where they can pivot and try to make some good from this opportunity. And what you see time and time again is those who follow that path have an opportunity not only come out, but they usually come out in many cases stronger. And they come out with a well of goodwill that says, here's a human who was fallible, who failed, who fell down, and who got back up. And we love to root for that person to not only get back up again, but to get back up higher than they were before. So
after whatever prep your organization can do, you're inevitably hit with the communications crisis. So you devote the second part of your book to short chapters offering a lot of great practical advice and tips for strategies and tactics that companies can utilize to combat and minimize a crisis. We obviously can't go through all of them, and we want people to buy your book. So, but what would you say are perhaps the most important one or two tactics that those hit with a crisis should employ to start turning things around?
So let's go super tactical. I love super tactical questions. So I would tell you one of the first ones I talk about in my book that's really important is you have to be where your crisis is happening. And here's what I mean by that. So, and I use a lot of examples in my book that have withstood the test of time, because we don't know, for example, if a crisis today is actually going to be a real crisis, or one that happened 2 years ago actually stood the test of time. So looking back with a little bit of perspective is how I like to kind of pull these examples up. So I'll give you one that I think is a great one. Domino's Pizza, about 15 years ago on Easter weekend, two idiots in middle of America working at a Domino's did some pretty disgusting things with Domino's cheese. They put the cheese in their nose, they put it in their pants, they blew their nose on the pizza. all of this cheese went on the pizza. They took video of it. You watched them videotape the pizza. You watched it go in the oven. You watched it go in the box, and you watched it go into the delivery cart. So some unsuspecting soul got these gross pizzas. So this video sat online for 24 hours, went viral, had over 500,000 views. Domino's never saw it. And this is to go back to the previous comment I shared earlier, but they didn't have any listening tools to be listening to whether the conversation was about their brand. The first time they ever heard about it was when a reporter called and said, "Do you have any comment on these videos?" And of course, Domino's said, no comment. They finally, about a day or two later, got a comment out, put out a press release, and that was their comment. The moral of this story that I try to impart to folks is Domino's put out a press release to a story that was happening on YouTube. They did not show up where their crisis was happening. People on YouTube who were seeing these grotesque videos and then deciding to order from Pizza Hut were not reading a press release, nor would they ever see that press release on YouTube. What would they have seen? They would have seen a video response from Domino's if it was on YouTube. Now, ultimately, Domino's got their act together, and another 24 hours later, they did post a corporate YouTube video. So for being very tactical, one of the key things that I tell people is you have to be where the crisis is happening. So if it's happening in video, if it's happening on TikTok, if it's happening in your local paper, that's where you have to show up to make sure that you're able to have a conversation where it's happening. One of the things I often tell people is, as a test, as I say, so most crises happen on a Friday. That's been my experience in life. They usually happen on a Friday. And for good measure, they usually throw in, it's usually a holiday weekend on a Friday. If you had to shoot a video responding to a crisis and post it to YouTube and to your corporate LinkedIn and Twitter accounts, do you know everyone in the chain of command you would need to make that happen? Do you know who has the password to those accounts? Do you know who knows how to post to those accounts? Do you have an iPhone that you can shoot it on? Do you have all the pieces you need to do? So it's a super tactical example, but when you raise one like that, everyone usually leans in and goes, "Oh my goodness, we don't know who runs those platforms." And we probably couldn't find them on a Friday at 8:00 on a holiday weekend to be able to respond. The last tactical one I would give you really quickly is, I talked about it before, but it's one that you really cannot set up after your crisis happens. And that is this need to be able to have the tools and the technical capability to monitor your reputation and what's being said about it online in real time. You should be doing this already, but trying to set this up, whether that's monitoring the Twitter feed about your company or whatever's being posted in the middle of a crisis, is exceptionally hard. And so, and you can't leave it to the last thing I think I would say on this is you can't leave it to the interns or to the new junior associate who just joined the firm. I can't tell you how many times I'll sit in meetings and they'll say, yes, the social media and digital media platforms today are run by, our new marketing associate who just joined the company. And I will always retort with the same response. I will say, is that individual allowed to go on the record with you for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal? Can that person go on Fox News and sit with Sean Hannity? And they laugh and say, of course not. Why would we ever let them do that? And I will say, well, I'll tell you what, their ability to post on social media is perhaps if not even more dangerous to your company. They're going to reach just as many people and have just as big an impact on your reputation as a company. So you need to be putting the same thought you put into those major news platforms into everything else you put out in the ecosystem.
But finally, Dallas, we call our podcast Next Round because of PRI's proximity to wine country and our love of discussing public policy and great books over a glass of California wine. So what wine, beer, cocktail, or other beverage are you enjoying to celebrate the publication of your new book?
I knew there was a reason why I was on this podcast. Finally, this is the first time I get to talk about my real passion, which is a great Napa Cabernet. There's nothing better. That is my go-to. It seems to make everything in the world better.
Is there a particular one that you like or would recommend to our listeners?
Oh man, that's like picking between my favorite children, which is anybody who has multiple kids will tell you you can do, but it changes daily. So right now I'm loving Fisher Stagecoach Cabernet, pretty awesome. I love the smaller wineries that are family owned. I love being able to meet the winemaker and understand kind of their passion for it. For me, wine is like an art, and it's just it's great. So I would say if you're looking for something special on a Saturday, it's not every drinker. The Fisher Stagecoach Cabernet is pretty epic. But I wouldn't turn my nose up to just about any good Napa Cabernet.
Thanks so much, Dallas.
Thanks so much, guys.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.